September 5, 1944. Calais, northern France. The decision was not announced. It was not debated. It was enforced through silence. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt entered his headquarters after weeks away, summoned back because the situation had become too dangerous to ignore. The maps were already laid out. 18 German divisions sat along the Pas-de-Calais coastline. Infantry, armor, artillery, fully formed, supplied, and intact. The last coherent striking force available to the German army in the West. The Allied landings in Normandy were no longer theoretical. They were underway. Reports from the coast confirmed sustained landings, airborne drops, and expanding footholds. Frontline commanders requested permission to move south. The operational window was measured in days, possibly hours. The decision, however, had already been made elsewhere. Orders from the highest level remained unchanged. Calais was to be held. No major movement was authorized. No counterattack was permitted without explicit approval. The divisions were to remain in place and prepare for the expected main invasion. That invasion was still believed to be coming. German intelligence assessments placed decisive weight on one assumption. George S. Patton would lead the primary Allied assault. His absence from Normandy was interpreted not as evidence, but as confirmation. Patton was not there because Normandy was not the objective. Calais was. Rundstedt reviewed the intelligence summaries. Reports from Normandy were downgraded as diversionary. Signals intelligence pointing to sustained Allied commitment was noted, then set aside. Reconnaissance confirming limited German opposition at the beaches did not alter the standing orders. The fear was not the Allied army already ashore. It was the army that had not yet appeared. Across the Channel, Patton remained in England. He was deliberately visible. His staff movements were observed. Dummy formations occupied open ground. Radio traffic reinforced the illusion of massed forces awaiting embarkation. Every indicator the Germans expected to see was provided. In Calais, the conclusion hardened into doctrine. Moving south risked everything. If the divisions left their positions and Patton struck the coast behind them, the war in the West would end immediately. That possibility, however remote, outweighed all other considerations. And so the order stood. 18 divisions did not move. They did not advance. They did not counterattack. They did not test the assumption that Normandy was a feint. They waited. This was the decision. Not to act. Not to verify. Not to exploit the only moment when the invasion could still be broken. By choosing to wait for a commander who was not coming, the German High Command committed itself to inaction. The consequences would unfold on the beaches of Normandy, but the outcome was already set in this room, on this day, by a decision made without gunfire and enforced without argument. At that moment, the military opportunity facing the German command was concrete, measurable, and fleeting. The 18 divisions positioned around Calais represented a concentration of force unmatched anywhere else in Western Europe. They included infantry divisions at near full strength, armored formations with operational tanks, and artillery units with intact ammunition stocks. Unlike the shattered remnants retreating from Normandy, these formations had not been bled white. They had not been forced into continuous movement. Their command structures remained intact. Their logistics lines still functioned. From a purely operational standpoint, these divisions were mobile. The distance from Calais to the Normandy front was approximately 200 kilometers. The road network between the two regions, while strained, remained usable. Bridges had not been systematically destroyed. Rail lines, though disrupted by Allied air attacks, were not required for an initial armored thrust. Fuel shortages existed, but they were not yet crippling for a concentrated, time-limited counteroffensive. The Allied position in early June was fragile. The landings had succeeded, but consolidation had not yet occurred. The beachheads were narrow. Supply throughput was limited. Heavy equipment was still coming ashore under fire and weather constraints. Command and control structures were provisional. Air superiority, while growing, was not yet absolute over inland movement corridors. German intelligence understood this. Reports from field officers and staff assessments acknowledged that the Allied forces at the beaches lacked depth. There were no significant reserves immediately behind the landing zones. A rapid, coordinated German strike had the potential to reach the coast before the Allies could fully organize their defenses. The terrain favored such action. The Norman countryside, before the Allies pushed inland into the bocage, offered open approaches suitable for armored movement. German doctrine emphasized rapid concentration and decisive counterattack against an enemy lodgment. This was the scenario for which the panzer divisions had been designed. Timing was decisive. A counterattack launched within the first 72 hours could have forced the Allies to divert landing craft, halt reinforcement, and potentially evacuate portions of the beachhead. Even a partial success would have disrupted the invasion timetable and imposed delays measured in months. The Germans did not need to annihilate the Allied forces. They needed only to destabilize them. Breaking the continuity of the landings, severing supply routes, and inflicting enough disruption would have forced Allied commanders into a defensive posture. The political and logistical cost of a stalled invasion would have been enormous. Crucially, this opportunity did not require perfect intelligence. It did not require certainty about Allied intentions. It required acceptance of risk in exchange for the only remaining chance to alter the campaign's trajectory. German commanders had long operated under such conditions earlier in the war. The difference now was not capability, but permission. The 18 divisions at Calais constituted the last operational reserve capable of decisive action in the West. Once they were committed elsewhere or rendered irrelevant by Allied consolidation, no comparable force would exist. German planners were aware of this reality. Internal assessments acknowledged that if Normandy solidified into a permanent lodgment, the Western Front would become untenable. This was not hindsight. It was recognized at the time. The military logic pointed in one direction. Concentrate force. Strike early. Accept risk. Disrupt the invasion before momentum made it irreversible. That logic, however, collided with an overriding assumption that the real blow had not yet fallen, that the presence of Patton, not the evidence on the ground, defined Allied intent. As long as that assumption held, the opportunity remained theoretical, and with each passing day, it diminished. Supplies landed. Units linked up. Airfields were built. Command structures hardened. The opportunity was real, immediate, and finite. It existed only as long as the German command chose to believe that waiting was safer than acting. The warning did not come from a single report or a single voice. It emerged from a convergence of assessments that all pointed to the same conclusion, even if that conclusion was never formally endorsed. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt understood the operational reality with clarity shaped by experience. He had commanded large formations under pressure before. He had seen what happened when opportunities were ignored. When he reviewed the situation in early June, he did not see a deception scenario that justified paralysis. He saw an enemy foothold that had not yet hardened. His assessment was not dramatic. It was methodical. The Allied landings were larger than a diversion. The scale of airborne drops, naval commitment, and sustained reinforcement exceeded what would normally be risked for a feint. Rundstedt's staff noted this quietly, in language stripped of urgency but heavy with implication. The Allies were not probing. They were committing. Preparations had already been made for rapid response. Contingency plans existed for the redeployment of formations southward. March tables had been calculated. Fuel allocations had been outlined. The German command structure in the West had, on paper, retained the ability to act quickly if authorization was granted. Rundstedt was not alone in this assessment. Senior officers within OB West recognized that the longer the divisions remained fixed, the more dangerous the situation became. Intelligence officers flagged the growing Allied buildup. Field commanders reported that German resistance at the beaches was insufficient to contain the landings indefinitely. These were not emotional appeals. They were operational warnings. The core of Rundstedt's position was simple. Waiting for certainty would eliminate the last chance to intervene. The enemy did not need to be fully identified to be engaged. German doctrine had long emphasized acting against an enemy while he was still vulnerable, not after his intentions were beyond doubt. This perspective carried weight precisely because it avoided speculation. Rundstedt did not argue that Patton was irrelevant. He argued that Patton's presumed presence should not override observable reality. Even if a secondary landing occurred elsewhere, the destruction of the Normandy beachhead would still represent a decisive strategic success. Holding Calais at the expense of Normandy assumed a level of German flexibility that no longer existed. His preparation reflected this realism. Defensive postures around Calais were maintained, but not reinforced at the expense of mobility. Staff officers were instructed to keep movement options open. Rundstedt's intent, as far as he could express it within constraints, was to preserve freedom of action until the situation clarified. That intent collided with a different kind of preparation taking place elsewhere. The German High Command had spent months conditioning itself to expect Patton. His past campaigns had become case studies. His operational tempo was treated as predictive. Intelligence assessments increasingly revolved around identifying his movements rather than evaluating Allied force distribution as a whole. Rundstedt recognized the danger of this fixation. An enemy commander's reputation, however justified, could not substitute for current intelligence. He had seen reputations mislead decision-making before. The battlefield punished assumptions more reliably than it rewarded caution. Yet his warnings were necessarily restrained. The command environment did not reward insistence. Disagreement with standing assumptions carried risk. Rundstedt had already been relieved once for pessimism. His return to command was itself a signal that the situation had deteriorated beyond denial, but it did not restore freedom of action. The preparation, therefore, remained incomplete. The plans existed. The forces were capable. The assessments were aligned. What was missing was the authority to translate warning into movement. As days passed, Rundstedt's concerns hardened into certainty. Each report from Normandy that was dismissed increased the cost of delay. Each convoy landing unopposed reduced the feasibility of intervention. The window he had identified was closing exactly as anticipated. By the time the scale of the Allied commitment could no longer be denied, preparation without execution had lost its value. The warning had been accurate. The assessment had been sound. The foresight had been present. What had been absent was the willingness of the system to accept that the decisive threat was already in front of it, not waiting across the channel. The warning did not fail because it was wrong. It failed because it was politically and institutionally inconvenient to act on it. The overrule did not arrive as a single command. It emerged as a layered restraint, imposed gradually, reinforced repeatedly, and made absolute by the structure of the German command system itself. At the apex stood Adolf Hitler. His strategic fixation on the Pas de Calais predated the landings by months. Calais was closest to England. It offered the shortest crossing. In Hitler's mind, it remained the logical point of invasion regardless of evidence to the contrary. This belief hardened into directive. The strongest forces in the West were to remain there. Calais was not simply terrain. It was a symbol of where the war would be decided. That fixation translated into rigid control. Armored reserves were placed under direct authorization from the Führer headquarters. Movement required explicit approval. Initiative at the operational level was no longer tolerated. The disasters of previous years had convinced Hitler that generals could not be trusted with independent judgment. Centralization replaced flexibility. This structure mattered more than intent. Even commanders who recognized the danger understood the consequences of acting without permission. Unauthorized movement of major formations risked immediate dismissal, court-martial, or worse. Careers had already ended for less. Institutional fear reinforced ideological rigidity. The German command culture in 1944 was not one of debate. It was one of compliance. Officers learned to phrase objections carefully, to raise concerns without challenging assumptions, and to wait for guidance that rarely came in time. Layered onto this was the psychological weight of Allied deception. The Germans were not merely misinformed. They were guided toward a conclusion they already expected. The presence of Patton in England was treated as confirmation of long-held beliefs. Intelligence officers did not fabricate the threat. They interpreted real signals through an existing lens. Dummy formations were not decisive on their own. What mattered was that they aligned with what the German command wanted to believe, that the most dangerous Allied commander would lead the decisive blow, that Normandy, messy and costly, was a diversion, that patience would be rewarded. Contradictory intelligence was not suppressed. It was contextualized into irrelevance. Reports from Normandy were filed as preliminary. Requests for movement were acknowledged, then deferred. Each delay reinforced the assumption that waiting was correct. Action became riskier with every hour of inaction. The bureaucratic mechanisms ensured paralysis. Requests for redeployment moved up chains of command that were already congested. Each level added caution. Each staff officer knew that approving movement carried personal liability. Denying it carried none. Coalition concerns also shaped restraint. The German command had to consider multiple fronts simultaneously. The Eastern Front consumed resources at a catastrophic rate. The idea of stripping Calais to reinforce Normandy raised fears of catastrophic exposure if the expected second landing occurred. Strategic conservatism, born of scarcity, favored holding over maneuver. Even Rundstedt's authority was limited. His position allowed assessment, not execution. He could recommend. He could warn. He could not override. The final decision rested with a leadership structure designed to prevent exactly the kind of operational flexibility the situation required. Personal history played its role. Rundstedt had already paid a price for pessimism. His earlier dismissal served as a warning to others. The message was clear. Realism that conflicted with Hitler's expectations was unacceptable. Optimism, even unfounded, was safer. The overrule, therefore, did not need to be argued. It was implicit. Standing orders held. No new authorization arrived. Silence became policy. As days passed, the institutional logic inverted itself. The longer the divisions remained in place, the more dangerous it became to move them. Allied air power increased. Roads became more vulnerable. The risk that had once justified inaction now justified continued paralysis. By the time the deception unraveled, the structure that enforced it remained intact. Recognition did not equal permission. Awareness did not equal action. The system had chosen certainty over initiative, obedience over judgment, and expectation over evidence. It did so not out of ignorance, but out of fear of deviation. This was the overrule, not a shouted command, but a suffocating accumulation of constraints that made movement impossible without destroying the very officers expected to order it. The decision to hold Calais was not sustained because it was correct. It was sustained because the German command system had lost the ability to revise itself under pressure. By the time that failure became undeniable, the opportunity it had suppressed no longer existed. The consequences unfolded without drama, but with absolute finality. As the German divisions remained fixed at Calais, the Allied lodgment in Normandy transformed from a vulnerability into a foundation. What had begun as scattered footholds along exposed beaches hardened into a continuous front. The absence of a major German counterstroke in the opening days removed the only pressure that could have fractured the invasion before it stabilized. Every hour of German inaction had compounding effects. Supplies moved ashore in increasing volume. Artillery was placed beyond the reach of coastal fire. Temporary command posts became permanent headquarters. Units that should have been isolated were linked together. What could have been severed early now required deliberate, large-scale operations to dislodge. The German forces that did engage in Normandy were insufficient for the task assigned to them. They were understrength, exhausted, and committed piecemeal. Without the mass of the Calais divisions, counterattacks lacked weight. They could harass. They could delay. They could not break the line. Air superiority magnified this imbalance. As Allied air power expanded inland, movement became increasingly dangerous. Roads that had been open corridors days earlier turned into kill zones. The risk calculus inverted completely. What had once been a feasible redeployment now bordered on operational suicide. The very delay intended to ensure safety made action impossible. By the time the German command acknowledged that Normandy was the main effort, the situation had already passed the point of correction. The decision to move divisions south was no longer a question of will. It was a question of physics. Fuel shortages worsened. Rail lines were cut. Daylight movement invited destruction. The window Rundstedt had identified was closed. The broader consequences followed in sequence. The Allied breakout from Normandy did not require brilliance. It required continuity. German defenses, deprived of depth and reserves, collapsed under sustained pressure. Once the front ruptured, there were no intact formations left to seal it. Calais itself became strategically irrelevant. The divisions that had been preserved to defeat Patton never encountered him there. They remained positioned to repel an invasion that never came, while the war moved around them. When they were finally committed, it was too late to influence the campaign's direction. They were reacting to defeat rather than shaping events. The psychological impact on the German command was corrosive. Officers who had obeyed orders now understood the cost of that obedience. Initiative, already suppressed, disappeared entirely. Subsequent decisions became more cautious, more centralized, and more detached from battlefield reality. The precedent had been set. Waiting was safer than acting, even when waiting guaranteed loss. This paralysis echoed forward. Later counteroffensives lacked coherence. Attempts to regain initiative were delayed, over-controlled, and predictable. The memory of Calais lingered, reinforcing the belief that deviation invited punishment while compliance merely postponed failure. On the Allied side, the absence of early resistance reshaped the campaign's tempo. What might have become a grinding containment operation evolved into a sustained advance. Normandy became not a beachhead to be defended, but a platform for liberation. France unfolded rapidly once the German front lost cohesion. The consequences extended beyond territory. The failure to contest Normandy decisively ensured that the Western Allies would advance deep into Europe. Strategic options narrowed. Resources were lost that could never be replaced. Political leverage eroded as military weakness became visible. None of this required extraordinary Allied ingenuity after the landings. It required only time. Time was the one resource the Germans had chosen to surrender. Every subsequent loss on the Western Front traced back to that initial stillness at Calais. Not because those divisions later performed poorly, but because they had been denied the moment when their presence mattered. The battlefield merely recorded what the decision had already ensured. The invasion survived. The front expanded. The war in the West tilted irreversibly. The consequence of waiting was not delay. It was displacement. History moved elsewhere, and the forces meant to stop it were left behind, intact, and used, and ultimately irrelevant. The post-war record stripped the decision of ambiguity. Interrogations conducted by Allied intelligence in 1945 produced consistent testimony from German officers assigned to the Pas-de-Calais sector. The divisions had been intact. Fuel stocks were limited but sufficient for short-range operations. Command structures were functional. Movement orders had not been issued because authorization had never been granted, not because movement was impossible. These statements were corroborated by captured operational logs. Daily situation reports from OB West showed repeated acknowledgments of Allied buildup in Normandy, paired with unchanged directives to hold position. The contradiction was documented, not concealed. It was normalized. German generals were candid after the war. Rundstedt stated openly that the decisive opportunity to defeat the invasion existed only in the first days. He described the refusal to commit reserves as fatal. His assessment was echoed by other senior officers who testified that once Allied air superiority solidified, any large-scale maneuver became untenable. The fixation on Patton emerged repeatedly in these accounts. Intelligence summaries recovered from German archives revealed that his presumed command of the invasion force at Calais dominated analytical weighting. Reports that mentioned his name were elevated. Reports that contradicted the Calais assumption were deprioritized. This was not a single analytical failure, but a systemic bias reinforced at every level. Allied records confirmed the effectiveness of the deception. Post-war evaluations by Allied planners detailed how minimal physical resources had produced disproportionate strategic paralysis. Dummy equipment, controlled radio traffic, and deliberate visibility achieved their objective not by inventing a threat, but by sustaining one the Germans already feared. Patton himself never entered the equation operationally. He commanded no forces in the opening phase. He issued no orders relevant to Normandy. His role existed entirely in German perception. The post-war irony was noted even in Allied assessments. An army group that did not exist immobilized the only force capable of disrupting the invasion. The broader institutional lesson was documented without commentary. German command centralization, imposed after years of mistrust between Hitler and his generals, had removed elasticity from decision-making. Authority without adaptability proved lethal. Once a directive was issued, the system lacked the capacity to revise it in response to unfolding reality. Allied historians reviewing the campaign avoided speculation. They did not argue that a German counterattack would certainly have succeeded. They noted only that it was the only remaining option with strategic relevance. By declining to exercise it, the German command surrendered initiative permanently. The record also dispelled the notion that the decision was made in ignorance. Intelligence existed. Warnings were issued. Preparations were outlined. What failed was not awareness, but the willingness to accept operational risk in defiance of political expectation. By the time the German command acknowledged the deception, it no longer mattered. The invasion had become irreversible. The moment when 18 divisions could influence the outcome had passed. They remained present on the map, but absent from the war's decisive phase. In post-war analyses, this episode was not treated as a mystery. It was treated as a case study in how perception can override capability and how systems designed to enforce control can become instruments of paralysis. There was no controversy in the record. The decision to hold Calais was identified as a strategic error rooted in fear, rigidity, and misjudged certainty. The consequences were traced directly from that choice to the collapse of the Western Front. Nothing in the archives suggested an alternative explanation. No hidden constraint emerged. No overlooked factor changed the conclusion. The case, once examined without wartime illusions, closed itself. The decision at Calais stands as a closed case. 18 German divisions remained stationary at the decisive moment of the war in Western Europe. They were not destroyed. They were not mispositioned. They were not incapable of movement. They waited because the system demanded waiting. The reason was not logistics. It was not terrain. It was not a lack of intelligence. The reason was belief. The belief that George S. Patton would appear at Calais and that acting before his arrival would invite catastrophe. That belief overrode observable reality. It displaced evidence from Normandy. It neutralized operational doctrine. It converted caution into paralysis. The German command did not lose the battle at Calais. No battle occurred. What was lost was the only opportunity to contest the invasion while it remained vulnerable. Once that opportunity passed, no subsequent action could reverse the outcome. The Allied deception succeeded because it aligned with existing fears. It did not create obsession. It exploited it. A phantom army immobilized a real one. Reputation replaced reconnaissance. Expectation replaced judgment. The command system ensured compliance. Authority was centralized. Initiative was punished. Revision was impossible. Once the decision to hold Calais was locked in, the machinery of command enforced it automatically, even as conditions changed beyond recognition. The consequences were absolute. Normandy became permanent. France was liberated. The Western Front collapsed in sequence. Each later German defeat traced back to the moment when the last intact reserve was withheld from action. No alternative explanation survived scrutiny. The divisions could have moved. The warning existed. The opportunity was real. The refusal to act was deliberate. This was not a failure of courage on the battlefield. It was a failure of decision-making under constraint. The cost was measured in territory, time, and strategic control. History does not record what might have happened. It records what did. And what happened was determined not by firepower at Calais, but by stillness. The verdict is final. If you want more closed-case analyses like this, subscribe. If you see the decision differently, leave a comment.